I can give you an example. Search for Common Ground back in the late 90s started a program called Golden Kids News Network, which was started by a former, at the time it was a child combatant in Liberia, who said, I want to get my voice in the radio. And that sparked a whole series of radio programs that Search for Common Ground has pioneered since the 90s in West Africa and East Africa. And in one of those programs, there was a young girl who came on the show and started to engage in a conversation. So the radio program was about making sure young people are interviewing other young people and adults, talking about what's going on in the community. This is during the war. And at the same time, this young girl, before she came on the radio, her mother has been selling her to prostitution because she can then make an income, so because there's no money and this is another way to make an income. During the show itself, somebody called in and talked about her own experience of this. And then later this girl was sitting with her mother listening to the same rebroadcast of the show. And the mother got to hear what her daughter was actually going through. The point here is that creating that enabling environment for people to hear, to trust each other, to understand the struggles people are going through. So one way radio programs can actually help in that, because it's not your own context, it's somebody else's. But by hearing your own struggles through another person's viewpoints, you're able to internalize it. We do that on TV programs using soap operas also. I think that's another safe way of bringing out these things. In refugee camps, displaced people's camps, you can create safe spaces for children under a protective mechanism to actually learn. That's another way of, it's about that safe environment in a complex environment, especially with children. Children see tragedy at the very early stages of onset of a conflict. So you want to make sure you create a safe space for that. Adults see, 3 to 4 months later, so you program accordingly. That answer a little bit?
Yeah. So just to make sure I'm hearing correctly, that children see tragedy sooner, or it faces them much closer than an adult that can maybe look 3, 4, 5 years ahead.
2, 3 months.
2, 3 months ahead.
For the trauma to hit adults, sometimes it takes a little longer than for young people.
Okay.
So the immediate responses are to make sure children have a safe space, and creating a safe space where they are creating a sense of normalcy in that safe space. So if you're in a conflict or a disaster zone, you make sure that there's a school environment within the camp, creating the sense of normalcy. Everyday actions that children would normally do are done in a camp environment, whether it's for playing or reading or writing, whether it's under a tree or inside a tent. It's that sense of normalcy that is important, because the more normal they become, the environment they are in, the sooner they are able to get programmed out of that trauma itself. Whereas for adults, they're able to process things slightly differently. They put away the conflict to deal with the immediacy of things. And then later on, when they're quietly sitting, then the memories start to hit. My father or my son getting raped or tortured, or my son or daughter being hit by a wave and getting drowned. And when they are in a quiet environment is when they get to see that. Do you see? So it's the first responders are for children. Then you deal with the adults from a programming perspective.
Yeah, I think another interesting dimension is the expectations that we place on education for what comes after. If you all knew that there was no hope for you getting a job after AU, would you still commit the time and energy to be in a classroom learning? And I think as we saw with the Arab Spring, there was so much disillusionment with the leadership, with the educational systems. People had very little other option, and that in many ways helped to incite revolution. And so how do we build trust in our educational systems that lead to employment and vocation and contributing to society, so that there's a process? And I think that's another thing that's very hard when you're working in refugee camps and in conflict zones, when so much of society is already in shambles. How do you rebuild and then put trust back into that system?
Christina, I had a question about Sesame Street. Are there ever conversations that go on with the people you work with at Sesame Street Workshop, a conversation around peace? Like, is Sesame Street seen as that safe place that people can tune into? Like, I used to watch Sesame Street every single day when I got home, and it is this kind of like idyllic kind of neighborhood with all these really nice people and, you know, diverse and all these great things. Is there a conversation among Sesame Street and those you've worked with about Sesame Street being a place of peace for young people to tune into?
Absolutely. So that's true on a national level and international level. People who have been at Sesame Workshop for a long time give themselves credit for Barack Obama's election sometimes, because it was one of the first shows to actually have black and white characters on screen at the same time. So at the time it was really revolutionary to have this sort of integrated cast all together, all at the same time. It was in the 60s, and so when kids saw an integrated cast on television, I think that had a high impact in terms of how children were perceiving people of different races. So domestically, I think that Sesame Street, those kinds of social values of peace and not just tolerance, but love and seeing commonalities between all Americans was a very important educational goal for Sesame Street. And on an international level, Sesame Workshop has 25 co-productions in different countries, and in some countries the primary educational goal is peace education. So for instance, there is a co-production in the Middle East where you have Israeli kids and Palestinian kids on the same show, and the show is bilingual. And so that's one example. Also in Northern Ireland, peace education is a primary goal of the co-production of Sesame Street in Northern Ireland. So I would say that Sesame Workshop has really harnessed, and I know that we'll talk about informal education later, but informal spaces. So you might not have the opportunity to address topics in peace education within structured formal classrooms as well as you would outside of formal classrooms and on television. So Sesame Workshop has really harnessed the power of informal education and television and the penetration that that has, the reach to address peace education goals. There's a very good documentary called The World According to Sesame Street. It's about an hour and a half long, and I recommend it for anyone interested in how Sesame Workshop has approached peace education around the world. And it has some powerful footage of how difficult this has been, because even just hosting a meeting, so we will have a meeting before we even decide to have a co-production, and just getting Israelis and Palestinians in the same room, producers in the same room, was such a challenge, you know? So just the production of a video can have such an impact on the climate, and then once that video is on the air, obviously the impact is everlasting for kids. And there is research that backs that up too. It's not just us patting ourselves on the back, but we do have formative and summative research that points to the effectiveness of different Sesame Workshop co-productions in terms of peace education around the world.
Oh, excellent. That is a great segue into our next kind of small group discussion. I did want to mention another interesting thing, since we looked at education for health promotion 2 weeks ago. We talked about nutrition being important at a young age, even before they're of school age, the importance of breastfeeding. And I also believe Sesame Street, there's an interesting history about Sesame Street was one of the first programs where women would actually breastfeed on the show. This was commonplace in the late 60s and 70s. And then there was this move away from breastfeeding, and now you would never see that on Sesame Street. But I don't know if there's like a comeback in terms of encouraging breastfeeding and making that normal. I mean, there's been some really interesting protests here in the United States, at least, where women are not allowed to breastfeed in certain stores, and they're asked to leave or whatever, and they're kind of taught that it's something to be ashamed of, or they shouldn't do it. And to think about, back in the 70s, I mean, women were breastfeeding on Sesame Street, so I thought that was interesting. Okay, so next question, jumping into informal learning in our small group discussions. Let me put this in context for all of you. So there are not only various